All right, so today we're going deep on Pierre Gassendi,
Yeah, this guy.
a true Renaissance man.
Oh, yeah, philosopher, scientist, scholar, all rolled into one, 1592.
1592.
Wow.
So not exactly a household name today, but back in his day.
Oh, he was in the thick of it, arguing with the big names, Kepler, Galileo, Hobbes, you name it.
And what's really cool for us as philosophers is how he kind of bridges these two worlds.
Right, he's got this deep engagement with the ancients, the Stoics, the Epicureans, but he doesn't treat them like museum pieces.
Yeah, like he actually thinks their ideas still matter today.
Exactly, and at the same time, he's totally on board with this new wave of scientific thinking, observation experiment, the whole shebang.
So he's not just quoting Aristotle, he's out there looking through telescopes with Galileo.
Exactly, real blend of the old and the new.
Which makes him super interesting to revisit now.
Yeah, so for our listeners, think about it this way. What would a philosopher today get out of reading Gassendi?
Right, like what kind of tool, what kind of insights might he offer for thinking about knowledge, reality, the big questions?
Yeah.
Because he covered a lot of ground. We're talking empiricism, atomism, logic, ethics, you name it.
His work is massive, and one of the things that really stands out is his method.
Like how he actually goes about doing philosophy.
Right. He really dives into the history of ideas. He doesn't just want to come up with something new and shiny.
He wants to see how these questions have been tackled before.
Yeah, and he takes them seriously. He treats these old debates like they're still live options.
Which is kind of refreshing, right? Like nowadays there's this pressure to always be on the cutting edge.
Oh, yeah, gotta be original.
Yeah.
But Gassendi's like, wait a minute. These thinkers back then, they weren't dummies.
There's a reason their ideas stuck around.
Exactly. So let's see what they got right. Let's see where they went wrong.
And his writing reflects that too. Like it's full of references to classical authors.
Oh, yeah. He's always dropping in quotes from Virgil, Cicero, you name it. Even his French writing has this kind of old school literary vibe.
Like he wants you to feel that connection to the past.
Right. It's not just about showing off his knowledge. It's about saying, look, this is all part of a bigger conversation that's been going on for centuries.
And that's something I think we can lose sight of sometimes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But it's also important to see that he wasn't just blindly worshiping the ancients.
Oh, yeah. He was very much a modern thinker in a lot of ways.
Right. He was a huge critic of the dominant Aristotelian science of his time.
Which had been around for like, what, 2,000 years at that point?
Yeah, something like that. And for Gassendi, the problem was their reliance on what he called a priori claims.
Meaning basically just thinking something through without actually checking it against the world.
Right. It's like trying to figure out how a car works just by sitting in your armchair and thinking really hard about it.
You got to get your hands dirty, pop the hood, see what's actually going on.
Exactly. And that's what Gassendi was pushing for, this emphasis on observation and experiment.
Which put him very much in line with figures like Galileo and Francis Bacon.
Oh, yeah. They were all about this new empirical approach to science.
But what makes Gassendi particularly interesting is how far he took that empiricism.
Right. It wasn't just about science for him. It was about all of knowledge.
With the exception of theology, he really thought all our knowledge of the world ultimately comes down to what our senses tell us.
Which is a pretty radical claim even today.
And that's why I think it's worth spending some time unpacking his epistemology a bit.
Definitely, because it leads him to some really fascinating conclusions.
But first off, how did he actually think about the process of gaining knowledge through the senses?
Well, he was definitely aware of the limitations of our senses, right? We all make mistakes. We can be fooled by illusions.
Like that classic example of the sigging in water looking bent.
Exactly. But for Gassendi, the key was that our senses are generally reliable.
Like most of the time, they give us pretty accurate information about the world.
And that consistency, that regularity is what gives us justification for our beliefs.
Even if we can't be absolutely certain about anything.
Right. It's kind of a middle ground between being a total skeptic who doubts everything
And a dogmatist who thinks they have all the answers.
He called it constructive skepticism, I think.
Which is a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Because it means you're acknowledging the limits of knowledge.
But you're not throwing up your hands and saying, well, we can't know anything, so why bother?
You're still trying to build a reliable picture of the world.
Based on the best evidence we have.
And that's really reflected in his approach to scientific reasoning, too.
Right. He was a big proponent of what we now call the hypothetico-deductive method.
So you start with a hypothesis, an educated guess about how something works.
And then you test it against the evidence through observation and experiment.
And if the evidence supports your hypothesis, great.
But if it doesn't, you got to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new one.
And he also recognized that a lot of scientific knowledge is probabilistic.
Meaning we can't always be 100% sure about our conclusions,
We're dealing with probabilities, likelihoods.
which is a very modern way of thinking about science.
And it's all tied back to that fundamental empiricism.
The idea that ultimately our knowledge of the world is based on what we can observe.
So let's move on to something else. Gassendi's famous for his revival of atomism,
Ah, yes, the idea that the world is made up of these tiny, indivisible particles.
which goes all the way back to ancient Greece.
Democritus, Epicurus, those guys.
And it had kind of fallen out of favor by Gassendi's time.
Yeah, Aristotle's view of matter as continuous was the dominant one.
But Gassendi thought atomism made a lot more sense.
He thought it could better explain things like how substances mix and separate, how objects move and collide.
And he had some pretty interesting arguments against the idea of infinite divisibility.
Right, the idea that you can keep cutting something in half forever.
Which, to be fair, is kind of mind-boggling.
It is, but Gassendi thought it led to all sorts of logical and philosophical problems.
So he said, nope, there's got to be a limit.
There's got to be a smallest possible piece of matter.
And he called that the atom.
And he gave these atoms certain inherent properties.
Like what?
Well, they had to have extension, obviously. They take up space.
They say.
They also had size and shape.
So they weren't all just identical little spheres.
No, they could be different shapes and sizes, which helped explain the diversity of matter.
And he also said they had weight.
Which is interesting because it means they have this natural tendency to move.
Like they're not just floating around randomly.
Right, they're pulled downwards by their weight.
Which helps explain how they come together to form larger objects.
Exactly. And then the last property was solidity.
Meaning they can't be penetrated.
Right, they're like tiny little billiard balls bouncing off each other.
I'm picturing a cosmic pool table now.
That's a good analogy, actually, because Gassendi thought that all the complexity of the
All
world
the different substances and objects we see.
could be explained by the different ways these atoms combine and arrange themselves.
Like a giant Lego set.
Yeah, basically. And he even tried to connect this back to the traditional four elements.
Earth, air, fire, water.
Right. He thought those elements were themselves composed of specific arrangements of atoms.
So it was a very comprehensive system.
Oh, yeah. He was trying to explain the whole universe with atoms.
But how much empirical evidence did he actually have for this?
Well, that's the tricky part, right? This was the 17th century.
No electron microscopes back then.
No, they couldn't actually see atoms directly.
So he had to rely on more indirect evidence.
Like how substances diffuse, how liquids evaporate.
Things that could be better explained by the motion of tiny particles.
Then by the idea of matter as continuous.
He also pointed to some early microscopic observations.
Which showed that some substances had a kind of granular structure.
So there were hints that matter might be made up of smaller bits.
But ultimately, a lot of it came down to what we now call inference to the best explanation.
Meaning, you look at all the evidence you have,
Then you choose the theory that best explains it.
and for Gassendi, that theory was atomism.
It just fit the data better than any other theory he knew of.
So now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Gassendi's views on ethics.
All right, so how did this guy, who was so focused on the physical world...
How did he think about right and wrong, good and bad?
Well, it's interesting because he was actually quite connected to this group called the Libertins Erudits.
Which sounds kind of scandalous.
It does, right? These were intellectuals who really emphasized reason and individual judgment in morality.
Like they weren't big on blind obedience to authority.
No, they thought you should figure things out for yourself. Use your reason to decide what's right and wrong.
Which kind of put them at odds with the church sometimes.
Yeah, they had a bit of a reputation as freethinkers.
But Gassendi himself was still a devout Catholic.
Oh, yeah. He never left the church.
But his ethical framework definitely had some elements that were kind of out there for his time.
Like what?
Well, he was sort of a hedonist.
Meaning he thought pleasure was a major motivating factor in our actions.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
No, not at all. But he distinguished between different kinds of pleasure.
Right, like there's the pleasure of eating a good meal.
And then there's the pleasure of helping someone in need.
And for Gassendi, the spiritual pleasures, the ones that come from living a virtuous life.
Those were the highest kind of pleasures.
So it wasn't just about indulging your every whim.
No, it was about pursuing the kind of pleasures that would lead to true happiness and fulfillment.
And he also emphasized this idea of libertas.
Which you could translate as freedom or free judgment.
And he saw this as the basis of our ability to choose between good and evil.
Like, it's not just about following rules blindly.
It's about using our reason to make informed decisions.
And that requires freedom to think for ourselves.
So what about Gassendi's views on society and government? Did he have a political philosophy?
He did. He touched on social contract theory.
Which was a popular idea at the time.
Yeah, Hobbes was a big proponent of that.
The idea that we give up some of our freedom in exchange for the protection of the state.
Exactly, but Gassendi's version was a bit different.
How so?
Well, Hobbes was really focused on the fear of chaos and violence.
Like the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short.
Right, but Gassendi thought there were other reasons to form a society.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, he thought humans were naturally sociable.
We want to live together. We want to cooperate.
And we also have this capacity for reason.
Which allows us to see the benefits of working together.
So for Gassendi, the social contract wasn't just about avoiding the bad stuff.
It was also about achieving something positive, like creating a society where people could flourish and live fulfilling lives.
Exactly. And he also emphasized the importance of individual freedom within that society.
Like we shouldn't just give up all our rights to the government.
No, there needs to be a balance between individual liberty and the common good.
Which is a tension we're still grappling with today.
Definitely. Now, we should also talk about Gassendi's views on space and time.
Oh, yeah, those are some pretty fundamental concepts.
And he had some pretty strong opinions about them.
Like what?
Well, he was a big believer in absolute space and time.
Meaning they exist independently of any objects or events.
Right, they're not just properties of things. They're like this background framework.
Like a cosmic stage.
Exactly, and he thought they were both infinite.
So space goes on forever.
Yeah.
Time goes on forever.
Which is a pretty mind-blowing concept.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's different from how Aristotle thought about space and time.
Oh, yeah. For Aristotle, space and time were basically just ways of describing the relationships between objects.
Like they didn't exist on their own.
Right. They were dependent on the things in them.
But Gassendi said, nope, space and time are fundamental.
They're out there, whether there's anything in them or not.
And did he think they were created by God?
That's a good question. I think he actually thought they existed before God created the universe.
Wow, so space and time are even more fundamental than God in his system.
In a way, yeah. Which is pretty radical.
It is. And I wonder what implications that had for his overall philosophy.
Yeah, like did it affect how he thought about the reliability of our knowledge?
Because if space and time are absolute and unchanging...
Maybe that gives us a firmer foundation for our observations.
Right, like the stage isn't moving, so our measurements should be more accurate.
But then again, he was always aware of the limitations of our senses.
So maybe it didn't make that much of a difference.
It's hard to say for sure.
All right, so one last area to touch on Gassendi's views on logic.
Right, so how did he think about the rules of reasoning?
Well, he was familiar with all the classic stuff, Aristotle's syllogisms.
Yeah, that was still the standard logic back then.
But he was also interested in other approaches.
Like the work of Petrus Ramus.
Who was a 16th century logician.
And he had this more pedagogical focus.
Meaning he was really interested in how to teach logic effectively.
Right, how to make it clear and easy to understand.
Which Gassendi appreciated.
Yeah, he thought it was important to make logic accessible.
Not just something for stuffy academics.
Exactly. But Gassendi also went beyond Ramus and Aristotle.
In what way?
Well, he was really interested in causal reasoning.
Figuring out the cause and effect relationships between things.
Which is crucial for science, obviously.
And he developed his own theory of regressus demonstrativa.
Which is basically a way of reasoning backwards from effects to causes.
Like a detective solving a crime.
Exactly. You start with the evidence and you work your way back to the culprit.
And he thought this was a powerful tool for scientific discovery.
Yeah, because it allows you to infer things that you can't directly observe.
So overall, Gassendi had a pretty sophisticated view of logic.
Oh, yeah. He wasn't just a one-trick pony.
He was drawing on multiple traditions, combining them in interesting ways.
And always keeping in mind the practical applications.
Which I think is a good lesson for philosophers today.
Don't get so caught up in the abstract that you forget about the real world.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's safe to say that Pierre Gassendi
was a much bigger deal than a lot of people realize.
He was a major figure in the transition from medieval to modern thought.
Bridging the gap between the ancients and the scientific revolution.
And his emphasis on empiricism, his skepticism, his atomism.
All these things are still relevant today.
They're still worth thinking about, arguing about.
And I think one of the most valuable things we can take away from Gassendi
is this idea of constructive skepticism.
This balance between recognizing the limits of our knowledge
and still striving to understand the world as best we can.
It's a humble approach.
But it's also a powerful one.
Because it keeps us open to new evidence, new ideas.
without falling into the trap of thinking we have all the answers.
Which is a trap that's all too easy to fall into.
Especially in today's world where everyone's got an opinion.
And they're all shouting it from the rooftops.
So maybe what we need is a little dose of Gassendi
A little bit of that constructive skepticism.
to help us navigate this complex and ever-changing world.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the thought of Pierre Gassendi.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
Until then, keep those minds open.
And those senses sharp.
Exactly.
All right, take care.
You too.